54. Arjun said, "What, O Keshav, is the mark of the man who has attained to the state of true meditation and equanimity of mind, and how does this man with firm discrimination speak, sit, and walk?" That soul which has resolved his doubts is in the state of samadhi or perfect absorption of thought in the Supreme Spirit, the one worthy object of meditation. One who has achieved even-minded discrimination by identification with the eternal essence, which has neither a beginning nor an end, is said to be in the state of abstract contemplation of the nature of the Supreme Spirit. Arjun asks Lord Krishna for the qualities of the man with a mind of equanimity engaged in such contemplation. How does a man with steadfast wisdom speak? How does he sit? What is his gait? Arjun has thus asked 4 questions. Thereupon Lord Krishna says, 55. The Lord said, "A man is then said to be steadfast in mind when he has renounced all the desires of his mind and achieved contentment of the self through the self." When a man has renounced all his desires and achieved his soul's contentment through the contemplation of his soul, he is said to be a man of firm discernment. This self is apprehended only through complete abandonment of passion. The sage who has viewed the ineffable beauty of his self and found perfect satisfaction in him is the man with a steady judgment. 56. He is indeed a steady-minded sage who is unmoved by sorrow and indifferent to happiness, and who has overcome his passion, fear and anger. Dipagan Fm. Sire Arjuna U Stita Prajasya Ka Prajahati Ya 70 Yatharth Gita. He whose mind is untroubled by bodily, natural disastrous, and worldly sorrows, and who has rid himself of desire for physical pleasures, and whose passions, fear, and anger have been subdued, is the sage with discrimination who has achieved the culmination of spiritual discipline. Lord Krishna then points out other qualities of this saintly man. 57. That man has a steady mind who is entirely free from attachment and who neither gloats over success nor abhors failure. That man has a firm wisdom who is totally free from infatuation and who neither welcomes good fortune nor repudiates misfortune. That alone is auspicious which draws a soul to the being of God, whereas that which pulls the mind to temptations of the material world is inauspicious. The man of discrimination is not too happy in favorable circumstances, and he also does not scorn adversities, because neither is the object which is fit for attainment different from him, nor is there for him any evil that may sully the purity of his mind. That is to say that he has now no need for further striving. 58. As a turtle pulls in its limbs, this man reins in his senses from all objects, and then he truly has a steady mind. When a man pulls back his senses from all sides and restrains them within his mind like a turtle pulling its head and feet within its shell, his mind is steady. But it is only an analogy. As soon as the turtle knows that the danger is gone, it again expands its limbs. Does a man of steadfast wisdom also, in the same way, let his senses loose after restraining them, and resume enjoyment of worldly pleasures? U. Me J. and $EV. Chapter 2, 79, 59. While objects of sensual pleasure cease to be for the man who withdraws his senses from them, his desire for these objects yet remains, but the desires of the man of discrimination are completely erased by his perception of God. The objects of sense come to an end for the man who has rejected them because his senses no longer perceive them, but his desires yet survive. The feeling of attachment lives on. But the passions of the yogi, the doer of selfless action, are annihilated by his perception of the ultimate essence that is God. The accomplished, or enlightened, sage does not, like the turtle, re-extend his senses to objects which are pleasing to them. When once his senses have shriveled, all the influences and impressions sanskar he has carried with him from a previous existence are irrevocably dead. His senses do not then return to life. By apprehending God through the observance of the way of selfless action, even the attachments to objects of sensual pleasure become extinct. Force has often been a feature of meditation, and by its use seekers rid themselves of objects of sense. But thoughts of these objects persist. These attachments are brought to an end only with the perception of God and never before that, because before this stage residues of matter persist. In this connection, my most revered teacher Sri Paramanand Ji used to cite an event from his own life. He had heard 3 voices from heaven when he was about to give up home. We respectfully asked him why these voices from heaven came to him alone, there had not been any for us. He replied that he, too, had the same doubt. But then he had an intuition that he had been an ascetic during his last 7 births. During the first 4 of these he had only roamed about garbed in a holy man's paraphernalia, with a sandal paste mark on his forehead, ash rubbed on his body, and carrying the water pot used by ascetics. He had then lived in ignorance of yog. But during the last EFJE less than UEEFG ve yele and VLESA Jamish VAI Ross 80 3 births he had been a true saint, as such a soul should be, and there was now the awakening of the way of yog in him. In the last life, final liberation had been almost at hand and the end was in view, but a couple of his desires had remained. Although he had firmly controlled his outward body, there were these passions within him. That was why he had to go through yet another birth. And in this birth, within a limited time God had freed him from all his passions, rendered him 2 resounding slaps as it were by providing him with all sights and sounds, and made him a true sadhu. Lord Krishna means precisely the same when he proclaims that although a man's association with objects of sense ends when he restrains them from reacting to these objects, he is rid of desire for these objects only when he knows his own self as the identical God through meditation. So we have to act until we have achieved this perception. Goswami Tulsidas has also said that at first there are passions in the heart, which are swept away only by true devotion to God. Lord Krishna speaks about how difficult it is to withdraw the senses from their objects. 60-61. O son of Kunti, men ought to subdue their senses which seize forcibly even wise and striving minds, and devote themselves to me with perfect concentration, because only that man's mind is unwavering who has achieved control of his senses. Mutinous senses ravish even discerning and active minds, and undo their steadiness. So with full control over his senses, equipped with yog and devotion, Arjan should find shelter in God, of whom Lord Krishna is an incarnation, for that man alone has a firm mind who has. Ulises sent Fhe Kiauflesu Heg. Chapter 2, 81, subdued his senses. Here Yogeshwar Krishna explains what ought to be prevented in the course of worship, as also the components of spiritual seeking which it is the duty of men to undertake. Restraint and prohibition alone cannot subdue the senses. Along with negation of senses there must also be incessant contemplation of the desired God. In the absence of such reflection, the mind will be preoccupied with material objects, the evil consequence of which we see in the words of Lord Krishna himself. 62. They whose thoughts are of sensual objects are attached to them. Attachment gives rise to desires, and anger is born when these desires are obstructed. The feeling of attachment persists in men who have yet got over their concern with the objects of sense. Desire is born from attachment. And there is anger when there is an obstacle in the way of satisfaction of desire. And what does the feeling of anger give rise to? 63. Delusion is born from anger, by which memory is confused. Confusion of memory undermines the faculty of discrimination, and, when discrimination is lost, the seeker deviates from the means of absolution. Confusion and ignorance arise from anger. Distinction between the eternal and the transient is obliterated. Remembrance is shaken by delusion, as it happens with Arjun. Lord Krishna says again that in such a state of mind one cannot determine wisely what to do and what not to do. Confusion of memory weakens the seeker's dedication, and loss of discrimination makes him deviate from his goal of being one with God. Here Lord Krishna has emphasized the importance of cultivating unconcern with sensual objects. The worshipper's mind should rather always be concerned with that word, form, incarnation, or abode by which we ulis efje less than uivheg bme. 82. His mind may be enabled to be one with God. The mind is drawn to sensual objects when the discipline of worship is relaxed. Thoughts of these objects produce attachment, which in its own turn results in desire for them. Anger is generated if the satisfaction of this desire is obstructed in any way. And ignorance finally undoes the power of discernment. The way of selfless action is also said to be the way of knowledge, for it has always to be kept in view that desire must not be allowed to enter the worshipper's mind. There are, after all, no real fruits. Advent of desire is inimical to wisdom. Steady contemplation is, therefore, a necessity. A man who does not always think of God strays from the right path that will lead him to ultimate bliss and glory. However, there is one consolation. The chain of worship is only broken, not completely destroyed. Once the joy of worship has been experienced, when taken up again, it resumes from the same point at which it was discontinued. This is the fate of the worshipper who is attached to sensual objects. But what is the lot of the seeker who has mastered his mind and heart?